Welcome to this training session brought to you by the Society of American Archivists, Archivists of Religious Collections section. My name is Holly Fiedler, and this is our land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that we live and work on the traditional lands of many indigenous nations. We know that indigenous peoples have suffered from historical and ongoing injustices and understand that this is an archival organization that we must work towards sharing historical truths and renew respectful relationships with indigenous communities. We respect the longstanding relationships that indigenous nations have to this land as the original caretakers. We are grateful for their stewardship and protection of the water and earth. We pay our respects to elders past and present. Today's topic is controlled vocabulary. Before I introduce our presenter, let's review the disclaimer. The content in these presentations is for information only and is not legal advice. Our views do not represent the organizations where we work. We do not make any endorsements or guarantees. We are not liable for any loss or damage caused by your use of the content we provide. It is your responsibility to critically evaluate the content provided in the presentation or any accompanying materials. Also, please remember the points shown on this slide you will not be able to use your microphone or video during the session. You can click on the closed caption button at the bottom of your screen, and under live transcript, click enable audio transcription to get closed captioning. There will be a question period after the presentation concludes. You can use your Q&A feature to ask questions. We do not answer questions in the chat or unmute attendees due to time constraints. Please be respectful in your interactions. We expect you to follow the SAA Code of Conduct. This session is being recorded. You also will have an opportunity to fill out a short survey after the session ends. Please do so. We encourage you to join the Society of American Archivists if you are not a member. We thank the Congregation of the Sisters of St. Joseph in Canada for hosting this webinar. And now I would like to introduce our presenter, Michele Combs of Syracuse University. Michele is the lead archivist at Syracuse University Special Collections Research Center, a position she's held for more than 10 years. She has served several terms on the SAA Encoded Archival Standards Committee to include its steering committee and technical subcommittee on Encoded Archival Description, TS-EAD. She has taught class sessions and workshops on EAD and trained many students and interns over the years, including how EAD intersects with the use of controlled vocabularies. She is also a freelance editor and indexer since 2006. Her clients have included O'Reilly Publishers, the Society of American Archivists, and a wide range of individual authors on subjects ranging from Freemasonry to library science to film studies. She lives in LaFayette, New York, with her husband and more animals than are strictly necessary. Thank you. It's a pleasure to have you. Michele, please take it away.
Thank you, Holly. Let me share my screen. And Holly, are you seeing that?
Yes.
Good.
You may want to make it to full screen though.
I will. We'll switch the slideshow in just a second here. So I'm delighted to see so many people here. I hope that what we're going to talk about today will prove interesting and not intimidating or scary. This is the basics of controlled vocabularies in archival description. I have tried in this presentation not to assume that anyone is a cataloger, not to assume that anyone knows how to use EAD. In short, I'm making no assumptions. So if some of what I say is too basic for you, bear with me because it might not be for other people in the group. On the other hand, if you're fairly sophisticated and you have, more in-depth questions than what I talk about, we will have a Q&A at the end, and I'll be happy, of course, to answer questions via email as well. So with that said, we'll dive in. What we're going to talk about today are the very basics of controlled vocabularies, what they are, how they intersect with other types of standards that we use in the archival world, and what kinds are out there. We are going to take a look at a few commonly used controlled vocabularies in the US. I have for that caveat because I do work in the US. All of my, work is done under the auspices of American standards. So I know there are other standards in Europe and in Canada and other vocabularies. But we will take a look at the couple of common ones in the US and how to search them, which is really the most important thing. It doesn't matter so much which vocabulary you're using as your ability to find the terms that you need. So hopefully what I show you will be transferable. And then we'll have some questions at the end. So just briefly, where this webinar came from, this is an adaptation of a three-part webinar series that SAA offered last year on controlled vocabularies. And the reason we decided to do that was based on some data that came out of the National Finding Aid Network project. This is a project that's exploring the feasibility of setting up a nationwide level searchable repository of archival finding aids. And in order to see how feasible that was, they wanted first to look at existing encoded finding aids and look at what elements were being used in that encoding, because that would tell them, what was the common basis of data that they would have to work with. Don't worry if you don't know how to encode or you don't know what EAD is. We're not going to get into that. That's just a little bit of background. So they looked at 145,000 finding aids, and they found that about 85% of it used an element called control access. That is the element in EAD where you put terms that you have gotten from a controlled vocabulary. So 85% of the finding aids had a space there for controlled access elements. Mostly it was people's names, company names, geographic locations, but less than half of them cited a controlled vocabulary as the source for those terms. And we thought that was really interesting and I won't say distressing, but it was a little disappointing because, as you'll see in just a few minutes, controlled vocabularies can be an incredibly powerful tool for searching, for discovery, for contributing your finding aids to aggregators. So we decided we would do a series of webinars on controlled vocabularies in hopes of getting people more comfortable with them and curious about them and maybe willing to think about using them. So what is a controlled vocabulary? We'll start with that. A controlled vocabulary is pretty much what it says on the tin. It's a list, it's a vocabulary, so it's a list of standardized terms, actual words, and it is controlled. And by that, we mean there is a process in place to determine the initial list of terms. There is also a process in place to propose and agree on changes to the list, additions, deletions, modifications. It is authorized, by which we mean some body of people has come together and said, for our profession or our domain of knowledge, we need a set of terms. We're going to come together and choose one. And once we've done that, we're going to use it and encourage other people who are describing our stuff to use it also. And that leads me directly to the last feature, which is that the vocabulary is available for use. In other words, it's published. People can find it and use it. There are both general and specific controlled vocabularies. Sort of general purpose ones include the Library of Congress name authority files, which is a list of names of people, George Washington, John F. Kennedy, and of places. There is also the Library of Congress subject headings, which is a list of terms you might use to describe what a collection is about. They're very general purpose. There are some specific ones, though, like MESH, which is the medical subject headings. This controlled vocabulary is very specific to medicine and nursing. So there are a lot of terms in it that you won't find in LCSH. By the reverse token, there are a lot of terms in LCSH you will not find in MESH because that domain of knowledge does not need it. There has currently been a focus on the general purpose controlled vocabularies because of the ways in which they can embody and perpetuate stereotypes and bias. For example, the Library of Congress has recently done away with the term, forgive me if I don't get this exactly right, but there was a term, illegal aliens, and they have done away with that in favor of, I believe it's just undocumented persons. It might not even be undocumented immigrants. Similarly, with terms related to people of color, the terms that were in Library of Congress often were not the preferred terms these days. They embodied an attitude and a perception that we did not, that should not be continued. So there's been a lot of interest in re-examining controlled vocabularies and also creating some new ones that serve communities that perhaps were left out or not acknowledged in there. That is too big a topic for us to go into, but bottom line, be aware that there are general ones, there are specific ones, and some of the general ones do tend to embody some older attitudes and perceptions, and those are being worked on. So how do controlled vocabularies fit into the broader archival landscape? When I started library school, I was completely overwhelmed by this alphabet soup of acronyms and all these different things that were getting thrown at me. So I like to start out by showing you how controlled vocabularies, which are also called value standards, that's the heading here, how they fit into the larger context. So you have kind of three kind of standards. There are content standards that tell you what kind of information should be in an archival description, in a finding aid. So DACS, for example, or ISAD-G, which is used in Europe, or RAD, which is the Canadian standard. They say things like your finding aid must include the creator. It must include some access points. It must include the languages that the materials are in. Then you have something called structural or data standards, which says how you should sort of store that information. So encoded archival description, for example, for the creator, it gives you a nice little element called originator, and you put the creator right in there. For access points, it gives you this handy element called subject, and you just drop your access points right into there. For the languages present in the material, it's got a handy element called lang material, and you just drop your language term right in there. Controlled vocabularies, which are also called value standards, give you actual words and terms to drop into that structure that will fulfill the requirements of that standard. So for example, you're finding, say you have a collection that was created by John F. Kennedy. It's his papers. So DACS says your finding it has to have a creator. EAD says put the creator inside the original tag, and the Library of Congress name authority file says this is the form of John F. Kennedy's name that you should use. Likewise for access points. DACS says you should have some access points. EAD says put them in a subject element. The Library of Congress subject heading says here is the actual term you could drop in there, Presidents -- United States. Similarly with language, we need to tell researchers what are the languages that are present in the collection. EAD, the structure, gives us a place to put it, but ISO 639.2 is the content, is the controlled vocabulary that gives you the actual code. So ARA, for example, is Arabic. ARP is Arapaho. So that's how controlled vocabularies fit in. They provide you the actual words that you can plug in to that structure, whatever it is you're using. It might not be EAD. It might be a Microsoft Word template to satisfy the requirements of your content standard. So then what are access points? Because controlled vocabularies are really where you put your access points. You get your access points for the collection. They're just what they sound like. They're ways into the collection. They're terms that researchers can search on. They are things that briefly give them insight into what the collection is about. So people often say, but couldn't I just do a full text search? So I've got a narrative description of my collection. Couldn't I just do a full text search and that will work? Here's the problem with that. There are a lot of words out there that can have different meanings in a different context. For example, you could have Washington the person, or you could have Washington the city, or Washington the state. Ford could be a person, it could be a company. Patagonia could be a company, could be a place. So a full text search of just a narrative, a piece of narrative text is going to be of limited usefulness to the researcher. They can end up really frustrated because they aren't finding what they want. They're finding things that match their search, but it doesn't have the meaning that they were hoping for. So the collection isn't what they were looking for. So that's why actually using access points from a controlled vocabulary is really helpful. It allows researchers to be much more precise in their discovery process. So different kinds of access points. There are people. It could be a person's name. It could be a family name, John F. Kennedy, Rockefeller family, whatever. There are also corporate bodies, organizations, and that can span basically any collective group. So it could be the Metropolitan Museum, it could be Planned Parenthood, it could be Planned Parenthood of Virginia, it could be Alpha Phi Alpha Gamma chapter at your university. It could be, in fact, even a conference can count as a corporate body. Access points can also include places, geographic names, so Los Angeles, Bali, Tahiti. I'm thinking of all these warm places because it's really cold here in New York right now. You can also have just topics that might be relevant to the collection, science fiction or animal welfare. Access points can also be titles of works. For example, we have here at Syracuse University the papers of Joyce Carol Oates, who is a Pulitzer Prize winning author. She's written many, many, many books and short stories. The record for her manuscript collection is, of course, called the Joyce Carol Oates Papers. But in the list of access points for the collection, we have included the titles of some of her books because in the manuscript collection are drafts of the books. There's correspondence with her editors about the books. There's all kinds of information about those books. So an access point into a manuscript collection might actually be the title of a work that has been published elsewhere. Perhaps most interesting in the archival world, access points can include the type of material that is in the collection. So photographs, letters, ledgers, wills, deeds, slides, videotapes, all of those kind of things. Because when a researcher is coming, they're looking for example, collection from the American Civil War, they might particularly want those with correspondence in them or those with diaries from people who served in that war. So type of material is a really important access point in the archival world. The last two don't get used a whole lot because they often are subsumed under one of the others, but you access points could also be occupation. You're looking for the papers of industrial designers or mechanical engineers or detectives. And then functions is an interesting one that is probably the least commonly thought of access point. That refers to whether the material in a collection was generated in the process of an activity. So for example, taxation would be an example of that. It is, as I said, probably the least frequently used. But it's important to understand this because people tend to think that access points are always, what's the collection about? What's the subject? And so they always think that it's all going to be subjects, but it's not. It's important to identify the type of access point. For one thing, that can help you figure out what controlled vocabulary to go to find your terms, which we'll talk about in a minute. But it's also important because when you put access points from a controlled vocabulary into your finding aid, usually your goal is that people will use them researchers will use them to find certain things. And so I'm going to hop out of my presentation for 1 second, and I'm going to share with you my screen. Let's see. Are you seeing, Holly, are you seeing my web browser?
For Syracuse University Libraries, yes.
Yes. Okay. So if I go into our finding aids, because we have put our controlled access points in the proper category, you can see you can browse by subject. You can narrow your search by type of material. You can narrow your search by language. And that's because we have identified not just the term, but also what type of access point it is. Go back to my PowerPoint. Okay. So that leads me logically to the next question about why would we use a controlled vocabulary for access points? Well, one reason is adherence to standards. We are a profession with a professional attitude towards our work, and that means we should be aware of the standards that are applicable and that we use them. So DACS, ICIG, RAD, all of those things. So using a standard vocabulary naturally follows from that attitude towards our work. Another good reason for using controlled vocabularies to choose your access points is consistency. That means that if I have a collection and one of my access points is George Washington, and I put his name in, if I use the Library of Congress name authority file to get the right form of his name, and my colleague at the next desk over has a different collection with George Washington as an access point, and he uses Library of Congress to get the preferred form, they will match. My access point for my collection and their access point for their collection will match. And so when a researcher does a search on that name, they will get both those collections. It becomes even more important when you contribute your finding aids to a broader community. So if you contribute to an aggregator, a local or a regional or a national repository where everybody can send their finding aids, if we have all used the same standards for names and for subjects, it will be so much more useful to researchers because they won't have to wonder, well, this person called George Washington did his name this way and this other place did his name this way. So now I got to do 2 different searches to make sure I'm getting everything. So it can be a really important consideration. Discoverability is really a really valuable benefit of using a controlled vocabulary. As I showed you in our finding aids, we have the different facets that you can use because we have used a controlled vocabulary to make sure our access points are consistent. Another good reason for using a controlled vocabulary to choose your access points is it makes it really easy to reuse them if you're creating a MARC record, a bibliographic record for your collection to go into your main library catalog. Library cataloging has been using Library of Congress name authority files and Library of Congress subject headings in the US for ages and ages and ages. And so if we're going to contribute a record for our manuscript collections to those library catalogs, it makes a lot of sense for us to use those same controlled vocabularies so that our data will mesh with what's already in there. So one of the questions then that people often wonder about is how many access points do I need to provide? And the answer to that, like so much of things in the archival world, is it depends. It depends on a lot of things. It depends on the size and the complexity of your archival collection. If you have a collection that's one folder, you probably don't need 30 different access points for that. On the other hand, if you have a collection that's 300 linear feet and involves 1,000 different correspondence and just a vast quantity of types of material, you may end up with 40 or 50 access points. It also depends somewhat on the nature of your repository. If you are a general purpose repository, like the Special Collections Research Center is, we may need to provide a broader range of subject headings because our users are going to be coming from a lot of different populations and a lot of different angles. On the other hand, if you are the Archives of the American Institute of Physics, your user base is going to be smaller and much more specific. So you may not need quite as broad a range, but you may need more that are very granular. It may depend slightly on the nature of your discovery system. That is how people are using your finding aids. If people are able to search them, then again, you're going to want to provide enough access points that your broader user base is going to be able to use it. If your discovery system is just print copies of your finding aids in your reading room, people aren't really going to be able to search. They're really going to be paging through it. And from that perspective, 2 pages of access points probably aren't going to be very useful to them. It's going to be more useful to have a few that are really well chosen and at a high level. Finally, it's also going to depend on the downstream use of your finding aids. As I said, if you're contributing to a local or a national or a research or a regional aggregator, they may have limits on how many you can do so that their database doesn't bloat. It's a little hard to say. The rule of thumb that we generally go by is trying to think about the researcher. If I put this access point in to my description and some researcher does a search on that term, finds this collection, and then looks at the finding aid, are they going to thank me and say, oh, I'm so glad they put that access point in, that was great? Are they going to curse me and say, I have no idea why they put this access point in here. There's like one postcard in 300 boxes. Why did they put postcards in there? Or are they just going to be confused? Are they going to say, well, I guess this access point maybe is relative, but I'm not seeing how. So there's a little bit of mind reading, I guess you'd call it, involved to try and figure out what's going to be most useful to the researcher. One of the things that people often say is, but I'm not a cataloger. I don't know how to use these things. Well, there are some ways that you can compensate for not being a cataloger, because we are not all catalogers. One is that you can exploit the work that catalogers have already done. And again, I'm going to drop out of my presentation here and I'm going to share my screen with you, and I'll show you what I mean. Let's say I have a collection on environmental activism, and I'm really not sure what kind of terms I should use. I can go to our library catalog and I can do a search on environmental activism, and I can find a bunch of stuff that's roughly on that topic. So if I scroll through and I say, okay, my environmental activism collection has a bunch of stuff on pollution in it, I can look at the record for that and I can see, oh, look, the person who cataloged that book used those terms from LCSH. So I can do environmental protection, environmental policy, and it looks like I can put a geographical thing at the end. Very cool. So you can do that with just about anything, and it doesn't have to be your library catalog. If your library doesn't, or if your repository doesn't have a library with books, or if it's really small, you can search WorldCat. You can search your local public library. The key is that what you're doing is finding a thing, a book or something that is similar to what's in your collection, and then you're looking at what did a trained cataloger decide were some good subject headings. And if you're using a library catalog, you can be pretty much sure that they're using Library of Congress subject headings. So this can be a really great way to sort of piggyback on work that trained catalogers have done. The other thing that you can do, and I know there are lots of strong feelings about Wikipedia, but you can go to Wikipedia and down at the bottom of every article, you will find this little section, authority control databases. And if you show that, it will give you a link to the name of this person in VIAF. There may be an LC one there. You can see here, there are controlled vocabularies for artists, for people, and for general things. So this can be a great place to start. Obviously, nobody ever wants to stop with Wikipedia, but it's great in terms of helping you find some vocabularies that might have the terms you're looking for in it, including the person or something about them. So let me go back to my presentation. And then, of course, the third thing you can do, which you've already done by coming here today and listening to me talk, is to get comfortable with some commonly used vocabularies. So this is what we're going to look at now for a few minutes. I'm going to walk you through a couple of commonly used control vocabularies so that you can see what they look like and a little bit of how to navigate them. We're going to start with the Library of Congress subject headings and the Library of Congress name authority files. I will tell you, I'm going to show you the sort of window, the interface that I use to search Library of Congress. There are others. If you have access to a cataloger, if you have a friend who's a cataloger, have them show you what they use to search the Library of Congress terms, because each interface has slightly different features. I like this one because it's super, super simple. So we'll go to that. I will share my screen. So this is authorities.loc.gov. It's a real simple interface. That's kind of why I like it. So I'm going to click on Search Authorities. And let me make this a little bit bigger just in case you guys can't see it. You can see here I have some options. I can search subjects. I can search names, or I can do a keyword search. So let's start with the subjects. To go back to the example I had, let's say my collection is about environmental activism. So I'm just going to plug that in. Let's see if it's a term. I might have guessed right. So I do a search. And here is what I get. So I don't see environmental activism as a term. There's environmental activism in Los Angeles, Environmental Advisory Service. So I don't see environmental activism as an actual term. So what I'm going to do then is we'll try it as a keyword. When I do a keyword, what it does is it'll take both words that I put in and it'll try and find something that has both of them in it. So let's see what we get. Oh, still don't get that one. So that's probably, okay, so let's try again. So environmental here at this point, this is where I would go to my library catalog and I would see, well, environmental activism, I'm guessing wrong. There must be some other term. So let's try something a little simpler. Let's try air pollution. So here we go. So in the Library of Congress, what you're going to see here is several useful things. This is the term. This column here has the authority headings. What you're looking for is something that says authorized. If it says references, then that means you're close, but there's a different term that they prefer. So look for something that says authorized over here. So this one, air -- pollution, Library of Congress subject headings, it's authorized. So I can use air pollution as my term. You can see here, it also will pull in some terms from other authorities. There is actually a children's subject heading. And if you were working on something where you thought children might be your primary users, and you wanted air pollution, you can see here, this is a reference. So if I were doing something where children were going to be my users and I was using the Library of Congress Children's Catalog subject headings, I could click here and it would take me to dust or smog or air quality. It's telling me those are the terms I would want to use. Subject headings, as I said, are always going to match exactly what you type in. If you want things, perhaps words in a different order, you can try keyword authorities. So let's try another one. How about adult education as a subject? So I'm going to do my search. It is an authorized term. You can see it says authorized right here. It is Library of Congress subject headings. It also says that it has some notes and some references. So if I click on this, look at what it gives me here. It says, oh, hey, there are a bunch of narrower terms. So when you start out searching, you might want to start with a broader term and see if it takes you to a narrow one. So libraries and adult education would be a narrower subject heading. Religious education of adults is a narrower subject heading that I could use. So that can be really helpful. The other thing you sometimes see when you're looking in the Library of Congress is what's called a scope note. And if you click on that, it will tell you that you can also use adult education as a subdivision under particular denominations. So look at this. You could do Catholic Church, adult education. You could probably do Sisters of St. Francis, adult education. So the scope note can be really helpful in telling you that your term is not only a main heading, but you can also put it as a sub to make it more specific for your users. And this is a perfect example where the nature of your repository might dictate which you choose. We're a general purpose repository. I would probably just choose adult education. At a religious repository, you might choose to put the denomination first and then adult education under it. I can also search by name. So let's say I wanted to find out what is the official term, the official way of doing John F. Kennedy's name. I can type it in if I know the first name and the initial and just say name. I do my search. There are several John F. Kennedys, so I'd have to look and see some of them are qualified by date. So this is clearly the one that I want. Authorized. If I didn't know for sure, I could do John F. Kennedy and I could say, let's do a keyword because maybe I'm not sure about the order or something. So if I do a search that way, you can see I get anything with John F. Kennedy in it. So Leonard Bernstein wrote a piece for Kennedy's inauguration. So that's why this comes up in the search. The keyword one is going to bring you up a lot of stuff, but it also brings up things like the John F. Kennedy, the aircraft carrier, the John F. Kennedy Center for Research on Education and Human Development. So if what you're looking for has a person's name in it, but it's a broader thing, you can certainly use those keywords to help you find it. The Library of Congress, you can also simply browse the names. Let's say that you know the person's name is Wilkerson and their name starts with a C, and that's all I know. So I can do my search and that will bring me here and I can browse down and see, okay, oh, it was Carol. That's what I'm looking for. Ooh, there's a couple of different ones, but that one's a reference. So that's not authorized. That one's a reference. This one is authorized. So we'll click through and check, see, is this the Carol Wilkerson I want? I can go into more information about her by clicking here. And this gives me a whole bunch more information. Let's see, she's the author of this book. That might help me figure out if it's the right person. Looks like she was associate professor of Spanish, so that can help me figure out. So the full record for a person can be really helpful if they have a kind of a common name, or there are two of them and you aren't quite sure which one is the right one. So that is really useful information too. So that's a brief overview of the Library of Congress. I want to make sure we leave time for questions. So real quick, I'm going to take you into the Art and Architecture Thesaurus so we can take a look at that. The Art and Architecture Thesaurus is, as you would suspect, geared for terminology connected with art, with physical items. It's created and maintained by the Getty Research Institute. And here's what the search looks like for this. Again, I'm gonna make this a little bit bigger so you can see it. The Art and Architecture Thesaurus is really useful for access points related to the genre and the type of material that's in there, photographs, diaries, etc. So let's say I have slides in my collection. So I'm going to type in slides. Let's see if that's an authorized term. We'll click search. And here it takes me into, I could use black and white slides. There's also something called center slide chandeliers, probably. Oh, I've got color slides. I've got lantern slides. So let's say that I have both black and white and color slides in my collection. The nice thing about the Art and Architecture Thesaurus is it's not just a flat list like the Library of Congress. It's actually a conceptual tree, kind of like the tree of species that has mammals, and that subdivides into this and that, and then each of those subdivides further. So this little icon right here, if I want to see what is the next level up for black and white slides, if I click this, it takes me in and I see, right above black and white slides, I could just use slides. And then I don't have to put in black and white slides and color slides. If I want to know more about this term, again, I can click on the term. And it gives me a definition, which is really helpful if, like me, you're not conversant with, different types of photographic medium or different kinds of images. This can be super helpful in determining, is this the word I actually want? It also will show you these are all the terms that are not preferred terms. So if you had a finding aid that had this in it and you were trying to correct it to be consistent with the Art and Architecture Thesaurus, you would change it to this term. This can also be helpful if you're trying to crosswalk to a different, to something that's in a European institution. It can be really helpful. And again, if I want to go up, I can say, well, what's the next thing up from slides? So again, I click that little tree and it takes me up again. When I'm in the tree, any of these I can expand. So let's say I see this here. It says photographs by form. And I think to myself, well, what else is there besides slides? I have other photographs. Let's see what my other options are. I can expand that out and look at this. It tells me all my different options. I might have cabinet photographs or cartes de visite or lantern slides. And that can be really helpful as well in helping you. You can sort of explore. And I will tell you, the Art and Architecture Thesaurus, it is really easy to get lost in there. It is so much fun to look at all the different terminology that's in there. Let's do a new one. Let's do journals, because that can have a couple of different meanings. That can have a financial meaning, but it can also have a personal meaning, like a diary. So if we do journals, so you can see we have a bunch of different options here: cash books, day books, diaries, journals, periodicals. So if I say, well, okay, what I've got is a diary, that's really what it is. So I can use the word diary. That's an official term. It is the preferred term. Here's the definition of it if I'm not sure. But let's say I want to see, well, what else have I got? I can go into the thesaurus again, the tree structure, and I can say, okay, journals, accounts. What else is under there besides diaries? Oh, look, commonplace books. Interesting. blogs are in there. I did not know blogs was in there. That's a surprise. So this can help you be more specific. So say I didn't know blogs was in there, but I know a blog is kind of like a diary. So I might search on diaries, and then I might do as I just did. I might go up the thesaurus tree and be happily surprised to discover that blogs is actually in there. So the art and architecture thesaurus can be just a lot of fun. Another controlled vocabulary for these type of terms is a Library of Congress genre form terms. I would encourage you to go and explore that if you want. I'm not familiar with it because we use AAT here, but it's another alternative, and I'm quite certain that Europe probably has its own. So I'm going to stop my share there, and we'll just pop back to the slideshow for just a second. So we looked at the subject headings, the name authority files. The MARC relators is really interesting. Let's see, it's 3:45. Holly, do I have time to show this one, or do we need to wind up for questions?
We have time. Go ahead.
Okay, so I'm going to show you the MARC relators term. I find this one also really interesting. So let me bring that up, and I will share my screen real quick. This can be really useful if you are wanting to have access points related to the roles that people are playing. So when I put a name in as an access point, I might want to specify, say my repository is all music. It's just a huge repository of nothing but music. It might be really important to me to be able to specify this name is an access point and they are the author of this piece. This other name is an access point and they are the arranger of this piece. Yet this third name is associated with this, and they are the lyricist for this piece. So having a controlled vocabulary for the roles that a person is playing can be really helpful if you're a particular kind of institution, if your end users are going to want to be able to narrow their search by this person as conductor, this person as lyricist, this person as lighting designer, or whatever. There are a couple others, as I mentioned. There's the medical subject headings, which can be really fun to explore. And there are a couple of good sites that just give you links to lots of vocabularies. id.loc.gov is a great page that just sort of has links to all these different name authority files, all these different controlled vocabularies. And it allows you to see what's out there in addition to Library of Congress. Another one that's good is VIAF. VIAF is great for names. It has a range that goes way beyond the Library of Congress because it is the international authority file. And it is a fascinating thing to explore. I encourage you to go there and take a look at it. More than we could cover today, but poke around. Don't be afraid. Don't be intimidated by what's out there. It really is a lot of fun to look at. So that is all I have to say and to show. I open the floor to questions. Anybody have questions?
Michele, thank you. And we have a few questions. The first question, what tool or method do you recommend for name authorities for Inuit names, American Indians, First Nations name, to be consistent across various aggregators?
That is a fascinating question. I wish I had an answer for it, but we're actually in the process of looking at, for example, the SAA's standards on Native American materials. And as part of it, we're going to be looking at, is there an authority file for those names? Increasingly, the Library of Congress is shifting away from what would you call it? Not alliterating, transliterating names in other languages into standard A to Z format. So in some cases, you can actually find those names in the Library of Congress authority files, and the preferred form will be in the native language. So you could certainly start there. VIAF, I think, is including that in their effort to be international. They're considering that not just by nations, by borders, but nations by peoples as well. But that is a really good question, and I'm going to look into that because I would like to know.
Thank you. What about upstream use of finding aids? Does that also factor into determining how many access points a collection can have?
I would have to ask, what do you mean by upstream use?
Potentially, if you are taking your finding aid and bringing it into either a regional or national finding aid source.
Ah, okay. Sorry. Yes, I think of that as downstream because I've created it and that happens later. But yes, it certainly can affect your choice of controlled access terms. Some aggregators have preferred vocabularies that they would like you to use if you're going to contribute to them. Some of them may have limits on how many you can have. I haven't encountered that, but it's a theoretical possibility. Some of them may, on their front end, they may offer faceted searching. And so they may say, well, if you really want to, if you want your finding aid to be able to take advantage of this faceted discovery, you should make sure that your genre terms are marked as, you know, genre form, and that your name terms are marked as name, not everything marked as subject, because that will obviously shove everything into the subject facet, which is not ideal. So there are a number of things that may come into play there. What you'd probably want to do is talk to whatever aggregator you're going to be contributing to and say, hey, what do you have a controlled vocabulary or vocabularies that you prefer? What's our best way to indicate this is a subject, this is a function, this is a genre form, so that people know.
Thank you. If your repository uses one controlled vocabulary like LCSH, but also has some collections that are more specific vocabularies like AAT, would be more relevant. Could you pull from both vocabularies?
You absolutely can pull from both, and we actually do that. We use LCSH, Library of Congress subject headings, for our subject access points. We use Library of Congress name authority files for our personal names, our organizational names, and we use AAT for our genre form access points. So you absolutely, and in fact, our catalogers are in the process now of adding fast subject headings. So you absolutely can, if you are encoding the finding aids in EAD, each of those elements has a place for you to specify what vocabulary you got that term from. So for example, photographs in EAD, that would go in a genre form element, and I've got an attribute source where I can say AAT. That's really handy if you're going to take your finding aids and generate a bibliographic record from them, because that means it will come into the MARC record with the appropriate MARC field and subfields. So that's something to think about. If you're intending downstream use for bibliographic records, you can use from different vocabularies, but you might want to document which term came from which vocabulary. That also allows aggregators to use only particular subject terms. So let's say you used AAT and Library of Congress genre form terms for your genres and forms, but your aggregator can then say, well, we don't use LCGFT, so we're going to ignore those when we aggregate your finding aid. We'll just kind of pretend those don't exist, but we'll use all of your AAT terms, or your library, or vice versa.
That folds into this question very well. Do you generally want to choose the most specific term available or not?
I have to fall back on my usual, it depends. Generally, it depends really, I think, largely on the type of repository you are. We are a general purpose repository. So we would put in just slides. We wouldn't say black and white slides, color slides, all these different kinds of slides, because most of our users aren't looking for something at that level, and we don't have enough material of that specific a type necessarily to want to identify it. Now, if I were the George Eastman House and I were a photographic repository with nothing but stuff related to photographs and photography, my user base is going to be, they're going to know more than I do, and they're going to be really specific in what they want. So I'm going to want to give them more specific access points. And I'm also going to want to, I had a thought, I lost it there. And also because as that type of repository, I would have enough of that specific type to make it worthwhile calling it out individually.
So what happens when LC subject headings change? Can cataloging software auto-update them?
This is a fabulous question. I wish the answer was yeah. In your finding aids, it's not. In the library catalog, yes, that will happen automatically. So we have had cases where we created a finding aid, we used LC, we put in our access points, we created a bibliographic record in our library catalog, and our catalogers said, yay, verily, those access points are LC, you're all good. And a year later, one of those terms changed. So now my record in the library catalog doesn't match my finding aid. You have a couple of options at that point. You can just kind of say, well, that's the way it goes. Particularly if you're a small repository, you don't have a lot of manpower. Or you can say, okay, every so often, I'm going to bounce some of my finding aids against the library catalog and see if anything changed. And if it did, I will update my finding aid. In an ideal world, when you put your access points into your finding aid, what you would put in there isn't the actual term, it would be a pointer to that term. And then when that term changes, your pointer would automatically update. I don't know anybody who's doing that with their finding aids. That would be a fairly sophisticated thing to do. But so the shorter answer is no, 9 times out of 10, unless you're doing something really sophisticated. Now, that said, I don't use, our institution does not use Archivist Toolkit. And maybe somebody who uses it may know whether that's something they're building into Archivist Toolkit, the ability to put in an ID number of a term so that it will automatically update. I don't know. It's theoretically possible.
Okay. If someone has a small archive of a 40-year-old 12-step program, is the Library of Congress the best bet, or a smaller source?
Good question. I think the Library of Congress is astonishing in the range of stuff it has. It is really amazing because stuff gets entered in there whenever somebody catalogs something with that term. So one thing you could certainly do is if you have catalogers or your institution, is you could work to get something added to Library of Congress if it isn't in there. We've done that. In fact, I just today emailed our cataloger and I said, we need to add Johnson, Hazel M to Library of Congress because she's not in there. She was considered the mother of the environmental justice movement, and we have a photograph of her in one of our collections. So you can certainly always try to get things added that aren't in LC. If it's a really specific, really niche domain of knowledge, there may not be a controlled vocabulary. And at that point, your best bet might to reach out to other places that also have that type of niche material and ask them, have they found a controlled vocabulary? Have they developed a controlled vocabulary that you could use? Because that's one of the best ways to get them into wider circulation is to adopt them and use them and tell other people working in that knowledge domain that they exist and that they can use them.
Thank you. Michele, thank you so much for your time. I recognize we have more questions, but we're out of time for this moment. And maybe this provides an opportunity that we need another one. I'd like to let you know that next Thursday, the January 25th at 3 p.m., there will be a talk on artificial intelligence, copyright, and education by Lisa Macklem at Western University. Thank you so much for your time, Michele. Thank you, everybody, for attending.
You're very welcome, and feel free to email me if you have follow-up questions. I will do my best to answer them.
Thank you, Michele.